Vietnam War began in good faith, by good people with good intentions, but some 2 decades later, it was all over. For the Vietnamese, it was not a war about communism, it was a war for independence, a war for Vietnam. But a combination of American overconfidence, Cold War tensions, and imperialist tendencies the Americans had previously fought so hard against, made the war in Vietnam one of America's darkest pages in its short but dense history. By the end of the war, more than 58,000 Americans would die, as too would 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas would also perish, as well as over 2 million civilians from both the North and the South, and thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. The French conquest of Indochina began in 1858. They boasted about bringing their civilization to Vietnam, beginning the construction of roads and bridges. But the Vietnamese did not take well to their French colonizers, just as they hadn't to earlier invasions by the Chinese. The French were the enemy, and the Vietnamese people struggled for independence. In 1919, at the end of the Great War, American President Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to help rebuild a new world, and advocated for the independence of colonized nations. Upon his stay in France, a man appeared with a petition for the president, signed by himself and other Vietnamese nationalists, asking that Vietnam too become an independent state. The president's secretary promised to show it to Wilson, but there is no evidence he ever did. Throughout his career, this man would go by some 70 names, but eventually settle for the most enlightened one, Ho Chi Minh. After taking part in a demonstration against a puppet emperor, Ho Chi Minh was marked for arrest and fled Vietnam in 1911, remaining in exile for 30 years. When he discovered the anti-colonial writings of Lenin, he became a communist. His fuel was for an independent Vietnam. By 1940, the Second World War had come. Germany had conquered most of Western Europe, including France, and the Japanese began to occupy Vietnam. To help fight the Japanese invaders, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and founded a revolutionary movement, which he named the Vietnam Independence League, the Viet Minh. This new fighting force grew quickly and relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, hit-and-run strategies that would later be used some 3 decades later when the Americans arrived. In the spring of 1945, 3 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government were looking for ways to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam when they were contacted by Ho Chi Minh. The OSS, the precursors for the CIA, supplied Ho and his guerrilla fighters with weapons and were impressed with how quickly they learned to handle them. Ho began to call his followers the Viet American Army and praised the United States as a champion of democracy. When 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese surrender seemed imminent. Ho Chi Minh called upon all the people of Vietnam to rise up and take control of their country before the French could re-establish their rule. On the 2nd of September 1945, the same day as the Japanese surrendered, ending World War II, hundreds of thousands of people went to Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi to see Ho Chi Minh proclaim Vietnam independent. The future looked promising, but President Franklin Roosevelt, who had campaigned for a world of independent, self-governing states, was now dead, and his successor, Harry Truman, was facing an entirely different world. The Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Europe and looked to spread further into Turkey, Greece, and Iran. A Cold War had begun. The French warned if their colonies were to become independent under American assistance, France would have no choice but to fall under Soviet influence. The French poured thousands of men back into Vietnam with the help of American aid. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Domino theory was at the height of political thought, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would as well. The United States sent tens of thousands of troops to push the invaders back north. They did so successfully, and it showed Western powers that communism in Asia could be contained. By 1953, with the help of American aid, the French had been fighting for 7 years in Vietnam and had suffered more than 100,000 casualties. French platoons would be ambushed, trains blown up, roads blocked, all for them to be ambushed again. The Viet Minh supplied by the Soviets and Chinese were a force to be reckoned with. The French were demoralised, and so proposed to begin talks to end the fighting. Before the talks began, however, both sides tried to enforce their military positioning. The French set up a fortified base in Dien Bien Phu, believing any altercation would result in a French victory. So confident, in fact, they saw no need to worry about the jungle-covered hills that overlooked their 11,000 men. 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers then surrounded the valley, and their heavy artillery began to fire. The French were trapped. After 55 days of brutal attack, the French surrendered, having lost 8,000 troops. After 100 years of colonial rule, the French were leaving. This decisive victory for the Viet Minh installed a belief that they could fight a great Western power and win.